Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive on something I know a lot of you have been asking about, autism spectrum disorder.
Definitely an important one.
Yeah, for sure. And we found a really interesting source that I'm excited to get into. Cheap ABA debunking the myth, autism is real and affects millions.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them.
So I feel like just from that title, we're already in interesting territory, right? Like there's a myth that autism isn't real.
It's wild, isn't it? And sadly, kind of persistent.
So how do we even begin to unpack that? Where does that idea come from?
Well, a big part of it is just, honestly, a lack of understanding about what autism actually is.
Okay, so let's break that down then. For those who might not be super familiar, what are we talking about when we say autism?
So Autism Spectrum Disorder, or ASD, it's a developmental disorder. Basically, it affects how someone communicates, how they behave, and how they interact with other people.
And the spectrum part of that is really important, right?
Hugely important, because it means autism looks different in everyone. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. Think of it like learning styles.
Okay, I like that.
Some people are visual learners, some people are auditory learners. Autism is kind of similar, but it's on a much broader scale, affecting how a person experiences the world around them.
So it's not like some people have it and some people don't. It's more like there's a whole range of ways that autism can present itself.
Exactly. And it's definitely not some disease that needs to be cured. It's just a different way of being wired, really.
Which is what makes that whole autism isn't real thing so strange to me. Like the evidence is right there.
Well, and that's where the numbers are really telling. Our source, Cheap AVA, they cite the CDC, which states that 1 in 36 children in the U.S. are diagnosed with autism.
Wait, 1 in 36? Seriously, that's way more common than I think most people realize.
Right, and it just goes to show that this isn't some rare or obscure thing. This is affecting a lot of people.
So, okay, if that's the case, how is autism actually diagnosed? Is it like a subjective thing, or is there a more concrete process?
It's definitely not subjective. It's based on observing behavior, looking at developmental history, and there are specific criteria that professionals use.
So it's not just a doctor going, I think this might be autism, and that's it.
Right. It's a whole process to make sure people are getting the accurate diagnosis.
Which makes sense because then it's not just about the diagnosis itself, right? It's about then figuring out, okay, what kind of support does this person need?
Absolutely. And that's a key part of why understanding the reality of autism is so important.
Because if we're talking about like, helping people get the support they need, we have to acknowledge that it's a real thing, right?
Exactly. And that's what makes those myths so harmful.
It's like we're living in two completely different worlds. One where autism is understood and supported and people can get the help they need. And then another where it's like, oh, it's not even real and people are just left to struggle on their own.
And that's the gap that organizations like our source, Cheap ABA,
Yeah.
they're trying to bridge that gap.
Yeah, speaking of cheap ABA, we should probably talk about them a bit. Their name is definitely, it definitely gets your attention.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what they're all about.
Exactly. So for those who might not be familiar, what is cheap ABA? What do they do?
So basically, they're all about making ABA therapy more accessible.
And ABA therapy, that's, sorry, just for anyone who's hearing that for the first time.
Oh, right, of course. ABA stands for Applied Behavior Analysis.
Right.
And it's a type of therapy that's often really helpful for people with autism,
Yeah.
but it can be super expensive.
Ah, okay. So cheap ABA, they're trying to make it less expensive, more people can afford it.
Yeah, they basically advocate for families, they provide resources and information, and they really try to make these services more readily available.
So they're really kind of like attacking this issue from all sides. Like they're providing information, they're advocating for change, and they're also trying to make the services themselves more available.
That's exactly.
So, okay, we've talked about the reality of autism, we've talked about the impact of these myths, and we've highlighted an organization that's doing some really great work in this area.
Mm.
Where do we go from here? What can our listeners do? What's the call to action?
I think the biggest thing is just to remember that creating a more inclusive world starts with each of us individually.
So it's not just about knowing this stuff, it's about actually doing something with it.
Right. It can be as simple as, like, paying attention to the language we use. Instead of saying autistic person, say person with autism.
Oh, I like that. Because it puts the person first.
Exactly.
It's not their defining characteristic.
And then another thing you can do is, if you hear someone saying something that's not true about autism, don't be afraid to speak up.
Mm-hmm.
You can gently correct them or share a fact or even just point them to a resource like cheap ABA.
So it's about having those conversations, even if they're a little bit uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes just starting the conversation is the most important step.
And then another thing I was thinking about was, how important it is to seek out stories and perspectives from autistic people themselves.
Oh, absolutely.
Because, it's one thing to hear about autism from, like, experts and researchers, which is all important.
Of course, yeah.
But it's another thing entirely to hear from people who are actually living with autism every day, to hear about their experiences and their challenges and their strengths.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And there are so many amazing autistic advocates and writers and artists out there who are sharing their stories.
Yeah, and I feel like when you hear those stories, it just makes it so much more real. It's not just an abstract concept anymore. These are real people with real lives.
Mm,
It's funny because at the beginning we were talking about how some people see autism as this like big, scary, mysterious thing.
right.
But the more we learn about it, the less scary it becomes. It just becomes about understanding and acceptance.
It's like anything else, knowledge is power, right?
Yeah.
Totally. And there's so many different ways to learn, too. Like you can read books.
Oh, yeah, for sure. There are some incredible memoirs out there.
There are. And blogs and articles and even just like following artistic creators on social media.
It's all about kind of like immersing yourself in those different perspectives, right?
Exactly. Because when you start to see the world through someone else's eyes,
Mm.
it really changes your whole understanding.
It does. So as we kind of like wrap up this deep dive here, is there any, I don't know, is there one big takeaway you're hoping our listeners will walk away with today?
If there's one thing I want people to remember, it's that autism is not a deficit. It's just a different way of experiencing the world.
It's about neurodiversity, right? Like our brains are all wired a little differently, and that's okay.
Exactly. And in fact, those differences are what make the world so interesting.
Absolutely. So embrace the diversity, learn from each other, and never stop asking questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. Well, on that note, a huge thank you to you for coming on the show today and sharing your expertise.
Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for another deep dive. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to all the resources we talked about today. And until next time, stay curious.